Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a video of a quick start on how to play Star Wars Unlimited. This video is going to show you how to all the cards do, the setup, all of that stuff, as much as I can do within a small amount of time. If you're waiting to do a pre-release, perhaps I might throw some stuff in there. First of all, you're starting with a base. You get to choose a base from all of the ones that you got to pick from your pre-release kit or your packs. And you start with the game with however much HP you have on the top left. So Castro City is going to have 30 HP, if you will. That my opponent has to get through in order to defeat me. Once that number hits 0, then I'm done. Some other bases will start lower and have some special abilities and stuff like that, but most of the time you'll probably have just 30 on a vanilla base, if you will. So I have to do 30 damage on my opponent in order to win this game. You also start off the game with a leader who is not taking part in the battle at the beginning. For example, mine is Jyn Erso. And one thing you need to pay attention to is the fact that these cards have these icons on the top right. So I have this red one, yellow one, and the white one. That's going to allow me to play cards without a penalty in the future. I'll talk about what that means in just a second. But Jyn right now has what we call a passive action. I can essentially tell it to attack with I can attack with a unit, and the defending unit will get -1 attack if I use Jyn Erso's ability to make that attack, if you will. And I'll talk more about that in the future. But essentially, Jyn has a passive ability that doesn't really happen, that I can choose to do as an action instead of like any other thing. There's also a backside to it, which is when I deploy Jyn. So the cool thing about this game is that when you meet that epic action requirement, for example, this one I have to have 6 resources in order, and I can deploy this leader as if it was a unit. I can do that later. Right, so that's going to happen later, but you do need your base, and you need your leader, and the colors are going to be important, as I'll talk about in just a second. Next, for example, you do draw 6 cards. So you have shuffled, you have mulliganed. If you have to, mulligan in this game is you put your hand back into the deck, shuffle, pick up another 6, but 6 is your hand that you start off with. We take a look at it. So we have, each of the cards has a cost on the top left of them. You can see that this card, this Sabine, cost 2 energy in order to play. So one of the things I need to decide before I even start doing anything is I must choose up to 2 cards. I can do 1 or 2 that I want to use as resources. So I'm going to use this card as a resource, and I'll tell you more about it why. So I'm going to put it face down as a resource. If you play Dragon Ball, it's essentially like doing that. Or Lorcana, it's like inking. Both of those games have this similar mechanic. And then I have 2 Ezras in my hand. If you have a card with a little star next to its name, that means there can only be 1 on the field at a time. Your deck can have as many different copies of it as you want, but there can only be 1 on the field. So I have an Ezra in my hand. I'm going to go ahead and put the second Ezra as a resource. So you can do 1 or 2 in your first turn. Now, here's the thing. You don't really have a turn in this game. What you do is you have actions that go back and forth, and then when the phase ends, everything will untap or unsuspend or whatever you want to call it as you use it. So everything as is being used does turn sideways to indicate that it has been tapped, for example. So let's say I have my 2 resources to start the game. Let's say I chose to do 2 instead of 1, and I want to put down a Sabine. So Sabine, I would pay 2. I would tap the 2, and I meet the requirement of, okay, I have 1 red and I have light white. 1 white. This means I can go ahead and put her down without any difficulty. So because my base and my leader kind of align with the colors for Sabine. But here's the thing. Let's say I had a different leader for let's say Jyn, for example. If I had a different leader for Jyn, if instead I had like IG88, for example, I do not meet the white requirement, and that means I actually have to pay an additional 2 resources in order to play Sabine as a penalty, if you will. So you want your cards to match the colors of your leader and your base here. So because Sabine would cost me 4 in order to drop, if I was playing with IG88, I would not be able to pay it. I would not be able to play Sabine, essentially. So I am able to play Sabine because I have paid the price, and there's no penalty because the colors match, essentially. That's what's happening here. So that counts as an action. So on here, you can see all of these are things that count as an action. Once you've completed an action, either played a card or attacked with a card, that counts as an action happening, and your opponent then gets to make an action themselves. I will also mention that your cards, when you play them, they do come in already tapped. So they come out exhausted is what we call it. So playing the Sabine, so I pay the 2, there's no penalty, I can play Sabine. Sabine is on the field, but she comes on suspended. Now my opponent gets to do one action for themselves as well. So my opponent can choose to do one thing out of this list. They can play a card, they can attack with a unit, use an action ability, or they can take the initiative, which I'll talk about in just a second. So let's say my opponent has set up like this. They have Darth Vader, no penalty when they played. This, let's say, was played already. This Admiral has a 2 and 2, so that's something I should mention as well. The cards have their attack that they do, and of course their HP that they do. HP, if you take damage, it's kind of permanent, kind of like Lorcana would happen. And the damage happens simultaneously, and your opponent's cards do not need to be tapped in order for you to attack them. So let's say we're one round later, Sabine was already called and she's standing. This card can easily attack into it. However, the attack is simultaneously happening. So this card is doing 2 damage to Sabine, but Sabine is doing 2 damage back. So both cards will take 2 damage to their HP. They'll both have counters. There are counters in this game. And Sabine now has 1. Admiral Ozzel has 1 HP as well. So they both do simultaneous damage to each other, even though my opponent is the one that chose to attack into Sabine. That's what's happening here. Another thing I need to mention is that you have what we call the ground troops side. Usually there's a lot more ground troops to a game, but you also can have your space side. So the cards will say on the top of them, let me take these counters off, what they are. So Sabine is a ground troop. I don't know if you can see that really well. Sabine's a ground troop. So that means she would drop on the ground side of the field. And this X-Wing is a space unit, which means it would go on the space side of the unit. So my opponent can only drop space units into their space side, if you will, and vice versa. Ground can only drop and attack ground. There's no interchanging between attacks between the two areas, if you will, unless the card says that it can do that. So there are some space flying units that will be able to bomb into, for example, the ground units, right? So that's a pretty cool thing that can happen and does happen sometimes. Next, so cards can come in suspended or tapped, whatever you want to call it. Once I have enough resources, let's say we are later on into the game, every time an action takes place, sorry, let me backtrack a little bit. Every time an action takes place, it goes back and forth, back and forth. So my opponent did an action of an attack. Now I can do an attack into, let's say, the base. The base does not hit back, so the base of my opponent would take 2 damage. Also, Sabine has on attack, you may deal 1 more damage to the defender or to a base. That means if I'm attacking something, they could take additional damage that way. So the base will take an additional damage due to Sabine's on attack effect. Next, my opponent's turn, not turn, but their action. So they would take an action. Whatever resource they have, they could play a card. Let's say they choose to use 2 of the resources to put down a Stormtrooper Lieutenant. It would come in suspended, right? And the game would continue back and forth. My Alliance X-Wing can now attack the base for 2 damage, taking no damage back. We're going to go ahead and do 2 damage. Again, of course, if we keep doing this and do the full 30 damage onto the base, we will eventually win. However, there's many upgrades that can and do happen. So once everything has, let's say you run out of things to do. So my opponent has now attacked again. Let's say they attack me for 2. My base has now taken 2 damage. Again, we're trading actions back and forth. If I run out of stuff to do, if I cannot tap or play cards anymore, if there's nothing more I can do, I can choose if my opponent had initiative, which is like they got to go first in the game, essentially, I can take initiative, and that ends the capacity for me to do anything. I'm essentially giving up my turn. If your opponent still has plays that they can make, they would go ahead and continue doing their plays. So if my opponent still had more energy, or rather resources they could use, they could put down, you could play an action or put out another unit or whatever it is. But the initiative can only be passed over once. And essentially, if I already have the initiative, I want to keep it, I can do that too. So whoever does it first essentially gets to keep initiative and go first in the next, let's call it turn, in the next phase, if you will. So everything has been tapped now. All the actions have been traded back and forth. Now we can essentially move on to the next phase. So at a phase change, let's call it, both players draw 2 cards, right? And we get to choose to put down one more card as a resource. So I'm going to put down this card as a resource, right? And then everything on the field will untap simultaneously. So it's not each player gets to untap, it's both players untap, and then we trade actions back and forth. So I have initiative. I want to attack with Sabine into the city again. Then my opponent's action, they would, let's say, attack into Sabine and finish her off. Let's say I had just too much damage, right? I can go ahead and use my resources to play another card. Let's say I have one that costs 3. I want to put down a Millennium Falcon, which costs 3, and I have no penalty because I have the yellow and the white as part of my Jin Urso, right? And Millennium Falcon has the special ability to come into the game ready, which means it can attack, not exhausted right away. I can attack with 3 into the base, do 3 additional base damage to the base that way. And then it would be my opponent's action. They can go ahead and attack with their Stormtrooper into my base, and so on and so forth. Eventually, you get to a point where, let's say we are going to untap again. We're ending the phase and moving on. Let's say my opponent chose to take initiative this time and I was not able to get it. They would go first that next turn. We draw 2, and it continues on and on from there. We place another resources. Eventually, let's say I meet the requirement for Jin Urso to have, and I have 6 resources, right? I can deploy Jin. So I don't know if you saw the ability that it's epic action. I can use it as an action that costs me free, essentially. If I control 6 or more resources, I may deploy my leader. I'm going to deploy Jin Urso as a unit. She is a ground, so she would go onto the ground side. And she has 4/7. She acts like a unit right now. If Jin Urso takes all this damage, let's say my opponent finds a way to essentially get Jin Urso's HP all the way down to 0 somehow, Jin Urso would just go back to being a passive leader, and she can no longer be deployed. So these cards have only 1 epic deployment per game. Once they've been deployed and defeated, they go back to being like their passive way, and they can no longer be deployed anymore, right? So that is essentially how the game works. I got to do enough damage on my opponent. They got to do enough damage on me. So there are cards that will heal the damage that you have taken. There's also the equivalent of what we'd call blocker in some games. So there's a few other things. For example, let me find one real quick. I don't know if I have one. Actually, not out here. Let's see. So there are cards that have the keyword called Sentinel. I do have one. This Chewbacca, for example, is a Sentinel. Essentially, if this Chewbacca is out there, my opponent cannot attack my base. They have to attack Chewbacca. He is a blocker. He does not need to be suspended or tapped in order for him to be a blocker or Sentinel. My opponent has to get through the Sentinel first. But there are cards that can get around that. For example, Saboteur. Saboteur lets you get around blocker and still attack the base or whatever it is that you want to attack, even if your opponent has a Sentinel blocking or guarding their things. There are also cards that are called events or actions, if you will. For example, I can play this for 1, and there's no penalty because I do have yellow. And it gives an enemy unit -4 attack for the phase, meaning not just the action, but the whole entire phase until all the cards unsuspend. So you got to be careful with that. You got to know what's happening. So you are trading actions back and forth. And then the phase ends and everything will untap simultaneously on both sides of the field. And then just whoever has initiative gets to go first action. And then we trade actions back and forth. If there's no more actions to be had, the first one to claim the initiative marker gets to go first the next turn. So let's say I choose to do nothing and I just want to take initiative. I'm not allowed to any longer attack. So these are untapped. I haven't attacked with them and I want to take initiative. I can no longer do anything. Once you take initiative, you're essentially saying I'm going to do nothing else. And my opponent can continue to go off because they haven't done that. They would, attack my base, play cards, whatever it is. Once you take the initiative, your turn, you can no longer take actions, essentially, which is what's happened. All right. So let me know what you think. Hopefully this video is helpful. I do find the game to be really fun. I'm not gonna lie. I played the pre-release recently, and I find it to be really cool, really fun. If you like Lorcana or Dragon Ball, those are similar games to what's happening here, and there's a lot of mechanics that happen just like that, and a lot of really cool combos. Not only that, but some really cool looking art and cards, full arts, and really, really nice situations that can happen, which make this game really fun. All right, so if you have any more questions or would like more videos, let me know, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.